in about 1997 was the first time that I ever heard Dr. Shaw speak, and it was at an Autism Society conference, and I was so enthralled by what he said that I bought his book. That's the Biomedical Treatments for Autism, the old yellow one. But like so many things that I bring home from conferences, I didn't read it, put it on the bookshelf. That's where it stayed for the next 2 years. And then my son, who is now 26 and who was then 13 and a half, had a major event. In hindsight, I'll call it a toxicological event, but it changed his life, our life. He was diagnosed with autism at age 2, but he was doing rather well. He had been, mainstreamed, not entirely, but partially mainstreamed for a good portion of his day. At age 13, he played the piano, he played the cello, trombone, and literally overnight, he suddenly couldn't do any of those things. It was like the entire world caving in. We worked so hard, we had done so many things, and suddenly it disappeared. He was suddenly 20 times more autistic than he had been, on December 31st. And nobody could figure out what was going on. My husband and I talked many times, we should take him to emergency because he's walking around the house with his hands up in the air, moaning in such incredible pain, and we couldn't figure out what from. And so we talked about going to emergency, and we realized, well, no, they'll just say that he's just, really autistic. But they wouldn't know that that wasn't his flavor of autism because we had done so much at that point, and he had recovered so well. Anyway, I was suspicious about the one thing that we had done differently. He'd had diarrhea for 15 years. Excuse me, not 15 years. He eventually had diarrhea for 15 years, but at that point he had had diarrhea since his MMR at 16 months old. And I mean severe diarrhea. And so the pediatrician had recommended that we try probiotics, which I think that's pretty cool for, a mainstream pediatrician to recommend probiotics. And they were just, the Fred Meyer off the shelf, no big deal. Probiotics for a 40-pound child as opposed to my son, who was then 13 and 220 pounds. And I was suspicious because it was the only thing that he had done differently. But everybody said that's absolutely impossible. Doctors said that's not possible to have a probiotic cause any huge event. So a couple weeks went by, things did not improve at all. I had stopped the probiotics after the first 6 days, just thinking anything new, you got to stop anything, right? And I started reading voraciously and pulling out all those books that I had bought at previous conferences, and I realized, I have this biomedical treatments, and I really knew that this had to be a biomedical issue. Nothing happens overnight unless it's a biomedical issue. And I knew that there hadn't been any trauma at home or anything. Besides, this is way beyond trauma. He was in profound pain. He used to be able to write. He overnight could not write. Could not play the piano, could not play the cello. And so it was like his whole world was just pulled out from underneath him. And then I remembered that I had this book, Biomedical Treatments, and I remembered that very fascinating presentation by Dr. Shaw 2 years earlier. And I read that book, I plowed through it. And oh my God. And then I knew what it was, regardless of all the naysaying of, nice, well-meaning doctors, they were wrong. They were just plain wrong. And I eventually got a hold of Dr. Shaw, And I asked him, is this possible, taking enough probiotics for a 40-pound child?
After dinner, I was tired.
My child was actually 220 pounds. Is that possible? And he said, absolutely. And so then he put me in touch with the nutritionist then, which was Phyllis. And she helped me get him back on very microscopic amounts of probiotics.
Once you get started,
and then eventually I statin. So essentially, Dr. Shah gets, one of my, I have a few carefully selected hero rewards, and one of them definitely goes to Dr. Shah, because at a period of our time in our life when I thought, the world was definitely caving in. His information was there, and nobody else's was. Nobody else had the information other than Dr. Kirk. Dr. Kirk had done a lot of work with yeast overgrowth, and but discovering that, you can have a massive yeast die-off reaction that can cause huge medical issues. And it took, 18 to 24 months to finally undo the damage that one massive yeast die-off reaction caused when he was taking these child probiotics for 6 days. So, consumer beware. Consumer beware. And I think that applies to anything, any of the probiotics, tiny amounts, microscopic amounts for some of our guys, and do that organic acid test first before you do it, because you need to know what level they're at. And of course, we've done the organic acid test a number of times.
Been able to eliminate all of this from every IE.
And he was already very, even after the yeast die-off reaction, he was, extremely elevated, especially rapinose, etc. So anyway, hats off to Great Plains Lab, and still listening to their webinars and getting information from them.
And how is your son doing now?
He's doing fabulous, absolutely fabulous.
How old is he now?
He's 26, and he works at a local community college. The use of his hands came back, after we resolved the issue, because really he couldn't even hold a fork. During those first couple of months, he could not hold a fork. And this was a guy who used to play cello, but he did eventually get the feeling back in his hands and his feet. Of course, tongue and mouth and all that was really critical too. He works in an office, has a beautiful corner office, and does archiving of documents, so copying a high-speed scanner and saving it to the computer. And I know that if we hadn't figured that out, so many things could have turned at that point if we hadn't figured out what that was, because it completely made him 20 times more autistic. But now he's doing extraordinarily well.
Okay.
So.